very good to see so many people here, and in particular such a wide international range of people with us. People from all across the world are here today, and that wouldn't normally have been possible, of course. Now, we've held a number of talks online over recent months, which have been well attended. And of course, a lot of our lives the past year or so has been conducted by Zoom. So I hope that by now everyone is more or less familiar with the technology. We would ask you, if you don't mind, to turn off your screens just to save bandwidth during the talks, and you will remain muted. At the end of the first talk, there will of course be an opportunity to ask questions, at which point I think we should turn screens on again, and anyone asking a question obviously will have to unmute him or herself. I hope also that my own internet connection will hold up for as long as we need it. If my voice or my picture fades, it will be a result of my living in the backwoods of North Oxfordshire, where the bandwidth approximates to that of an earthworm. And if that happens, no doubt one of my colleagues will come to the rescue until my own connection is restored. My name is Graham Speake, and this is my swan song as chairman, as I shall be standing down after today. There'll be a bit more to be said about that later at the AGM, which we shall hold before the second talk this afternoon. But for now, it's my pleasant duty to introduce our first speaker. Father Maximos Constas is no stranger to FoMA, having spoken, if I'm not mistaken, at no fewer than 3 of our Madingley conferences. This time, of course, we have not needed to fly him across the Atlantic to be with us, but we have got him out of bed quite early, though for a monastic that is scarcely an imposition. He is currently Professor of Patristics and Orthodox Spirituality at Holy Cross School of Theology in Brookline, Massachusetts, having been formerly a monk at the monastery of Simonopetra on Mount Athos. In addition to numerous scholarly publications, Father Maximos has translated as many as 4 volumes of the writings of Elder Aimilianos of Simonopetra. And it's about the elder that he is going to speak to us today. His text from Psalm 40 is, "I waited patiently for the Lord," and the subtitle, Elder Aimilianos, on faith, sickness, and suffering. So please, Father Maximos.
Thank you so much. For me, I'll say good morning because it's about 6:30 here. But as Graham said, I'm an early riser, so that's not an imposition. So many thanks first to Peter and to Graham for the opportunity to be here with you today, and to Nick for the technical support. I would especially like to underline Graham's many contributions to the Friends of Mount Athos, and not least his work on behalf of the Holy Mountain, including the important and impressive number of publications that he has produced, beginning with his Mount Athos Renewal in Paradise, first published in 2002, throughout his History of the Athonite Commonwealth, published in 2018, and most recently, The Life of Prayer on Mount Athos, which appeared last year in 2020, and many, many other works and projects, too numerous to mention. Graham, I wasn't fully aware of your bibliography until I looked into it yesterday, and I knew many of the books, but certainly not all of them. And it was truly impressive to see the direction your work took on from about 2002 and what you've been able to do since then. All of it very impressive and very valuable, and beloved by people who love the Holy Mountain. So I wanted to take an opportunity to recognize you for that and to express my own congratulations and thanks. So thank you very much. I consider it a blessing that today, June 12th, is the feast of St. Peter the Athonite, who was the first hermit to settle on the Holy Mountain. This was in the early 9th century, more than 100 years before Athanasios of Athos founded the first Cenobitic monastery, known as the Great Lavra, in 963. So today is the feast of St. Peter. And for all of us, that is a very happy coincidence. If a coincidence it is, but also, of course, a blessing. At this point, I'd like to share my screen with you because I have a PowerPoint that goes with my talk. Okay, I hope you can all see that. As Graham already indicated, the title of my talk is I Waited Patiently for the Lord, Elder Aimilianos, on Faith, Sickness, and Suffering. I begin with some general remarks, after which I introduce Elder Aimilianos with a brief biographical sketch. After that, I proceed to the main part of my talk, which is to share with you the Elder's teaching on suffering and afflictions. So let's begin. In this global pandemic, I often hear people ask, when will we go back to normal? But going back to normal is perhaps not the right question to ask. Instead, we should want to emerge from this crisis, not simply as we were before, but as changed people, a changed society, and a purified church, not simply a disinfected church. So before anything else, we need to make sure that the kind of mind that we bring to this crisis, and indeed to any crisis or difficulty, is not what St. Paul would call the mind of the world, but rather the mind of the church, which is a mind illumined by the grace of the Holy Spirit. Despite all of our medical advances, the mortality rate remains constant, 1 per person. Sickness, suffering, and death are unavoidable aspects of life. Modern society, however, has developed a near delusional denial of these realities, particularly of death. We value staying alive pretty much above everything else. But to appreciate life, one must hold within view the inevitability of death, including our own death. And this has been a philosophical and indeed existential principle from Plato and John Climacus to Martin Heidegger. It is also the experience of doctors and nurses who work with the dying. In 2011, palliative care nurse Bronnie Ware, who works in Australia, published a book called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying. These were the following. I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. I wish I hadn't worked so hard to the neglect of my family. I wish I'd had the courage to express my feelings. I wish I had stayed in touch with my friends. I wish that I had let myself be happier. I'm going to pause here and ask maybe Nick or Peter or Graham if my screen sharing is still visible.
I can't see anything.
Okay, so
Sorry to say, but I don't. Perhaps
I need to reboot it here. Let's see what I can do. Can you see it now?
No, I can see it. Thank you.
All right. I don't know why that happened. If it does happen again, I'll have to pause and turn it back on. All right. So these poignant wishes uttered by the dying remind us of how empty life can be if we have no sense of meaning or purpose, or if we have chosen the wrong purpose. This is why an honest awareness of the fragility of the human body, of how our mortality lurks just around the corner can move us to seek the meaning in life that we so urgently need. I understand that talking about illness and suffering is never pleasant or comforting, and even less so talking about death. But these are some of the most important chapters in the spiritual life. We like fine words and theories, but we don't always live in a manner consistent with them, because doing so almost always comes with a price. We may talk, for example, about the importance of humility, but we get upset quickly when someone treats us rudely or fails to acknowledge us in the way we think we deserve. Again, what we need is a new mind, new eyes with which to see the world, a new way of thinking. People talk about the need to, quote, think outside the box, but what they don't realize is that thinking is the box. In other words, it's not a question of finding a new theory or a new argument or a new line of thought, but something deeper, namely a new mind and a new heart. In 1 Corinthians 2:14, St. Paul says that, quote, the natural man cannot accept the things of the Spirit, for they are foolishness to him, and he cannot understand them because they are spiritually discerned. But the spiritual man judges all things. Here, the word natural renders the Greek word psychikos, which Paul uses in contrast to pneumatikos, which appears at the end of the verse. English translations of this passage variously translate psychikos as natural or unbelieving or sensual or unspiritual, all of them more or less adequate. The Greek word refers to a person or state of mind which is psychological, emotional, sensual, or carnal. It refers to someone who lives below the level of the spiritual, which is beyond his or her comprehension, because he has lost the ability to know spiritual truth, which for him has become like a painting to a blind man or music to a deaf man. Paul's argument is that spiritual things can only be discerned spiritually, and thus they are beyond the grasp of secular, worldly, and merely human ways of thinking. This is why Paul also says elsewhere in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18, quote, to those who are perishing, the message of the cross is foolishness, but to those of us who are being saved, it is the power of God. So the choices here are between something like blindness and insight, between the light of God or the darkness of the fallen human mind. I would now like to turn to the main part of my talk, the teaching of Elder Aimilianos on sickness and suffering, and I begin by introducing the elder. Elder Aimilianos was born in the suburb of Athens in 1934. He graduated with a theological degree from the University of Athens in 1959. He became a monk and was ordained to the diaconate and priesthood over the years of 1960 and 1961, and lived at monasteries in central Greece, including the great Meteora. He and his brotherhood relocated to Simonopetra in 1973, where he served as abbot from 1973 to 2000. He was a prolific speaker, and the monastery archive contains an astonishing 3,000 recordings of his talks given over a period of about 30 years. Most of these were talks given to monastic audiences, but many of them were given to laymen at parishes in Greece and Cyprus. These recordings are the basis of the growing number of his published works. After a long illness, the elder reposed in the Lord on May 9th, 2019. In his talks, the elder frequently addressed the difficult subject of illness, suffering, and death. In general, he understands illness to be a blessing, a gift from God, given to us so that we may draw closer to God and be united to him. Illness is not something that happens by chance or randomly, but is a concrete expression of God's providential care for us. Illness is an irreducible part of human life, and he says that the only possibility to live without sickness and suffering is if God has forgotten us or if we have forgotten him. It should be noted that for many years, the elder bore the cross of severe illness, which gives his words special weight and authority. I would now like to spend the next several minutes sharing with you some of the elder's words on sickness and suffering, which are relevant not simply to sickness, but to any kind of trial, tribulation, or difficulty that we face in life. What I will be sharing with you are a series of verbatim excerpts translated into English, and they come from the following two sources. The first is the elder's commentary on a select number of Psalms called Psalms in the Life of Faith, of which an English translation was published in 2015, and a recent publication in Greek called Awaiting God, Talks on Sickness, Pain, and Death, which was published in 2018. I'll now share with you a series of excerpts from these works that illustrate the main points of the elder's teaching. When we get sick or fall ill, we can become psychologically anxious. This is because the larger horizon of illness is death. It is a reminder of our mortality, and most of us don't know what we're supposed to do with the knowledge of our mortality. But if we do not come to terms with death, we will never really live a fully authentic life. For the person of faith, illness is the bridge to the other world. It is the bridge that can carry us from this earthly and mortal existence to God. This is true of all difficulties, not just sickness. Elder Paisius once said that 3 years of cancer were worth more than a lifetime of asceticism. Illness and sickness can thus be a blessing, but it all depends on how we respond to it. Illness is not simply an opportunity or a gift from God, but it is the very presence of God himself. These are themes to which the elder returns in many of his talks, especially in his reflections on the Psalms, where he says that God comes to us in and through our difficulties in the very midst of our afflictions. He reminds us, for example, that God dwells in the dark cloud, that God makes darkness his hiding place, and clouds and darkness surround him. The visitation of God can be terrifying, but we need to have absolute trust in him. In a series of reflections on Psalm 16, verse 4, for the sake of the words of your lips, I have kept ways that are hard, the elder says, whether we wish to or not, we are going to experience suffering. God will ask us to make many sacrifices and expect many deprivations in our life. How will we be able to endure them all? In the same way that David did, namely, for the sake of the words of your lips. It is enough for me to know, O Lord, that this is what you have asked for, that this is what you have willed for me. There is only one way to explain our difficulties. They are exactly the things that God wants us to experience and endure. And so, for the sake of the words of your lips, I have kept ways that are hard. David senses that not only has the law been ordained by God, but so too have his sufferings, which are likewise expressions of the divine will. The psalmist must therefore discover and accept the proper relation to his suffering. If he can do this, he will have transformed his suffering so that in the end, his only reality will be God. But if he continues to resist his suffering, refusing to find his salvation in it, his anguish will continue unabated. The question is ultimately this: will he offer himself as a voluntary sacrifice to the will of God or not? It follows then that the experience of suffering consists essentially of a conflict, for this is the moment when the soul is passing, as it were, through the clashing rocks of ancient mythology. In this dangerous passage, the soul has to make a choice, and the outcome will either break it into pieces or enable it to sail to its destination in God. And the choice comes down to this: will the soul accept or reject suffering? Will it make this suffering its own or struggle against it, seeing it as something alien to itself? Spiritual health is not found in the avoidance of suffering, but in its joyful acceptance. The psalmist's dilemma lies precisely in whether or not he will accept his sufferings or reject them, which is another way of saying that the choice he needs to make is whether to accept or to deny God. It is precisely the mistaken negative attitude towards suffering that constitutes the separation between him and God. But if I, meaning the ego, cease to exist, if my relation to my suffering changes, then I can be united to God. This union depends on the denial of myself so that God can come into my life. Elsewhere, the elder describes this conflict, this struggle with God, in terms inspired by Jacob's struggle with the angel. Through sickness, we become acutely aware of ourselves and the fragility of life. But if my eye prevails, my journey will be a descent into death. If God prevails, then our life together may begin. The choice between God and the ego is the choice between life and death. Anyone who wishes to live a spiritual life must accept the fact that such a life will be a struggle, a fight to the finish. I'm in one corner and God is in the other. One of us will be defeated, knocked down, obliterated. It is not possible for both of us to survive. One of us must be destroyed, annihilated, ravaged, and consumed by the other. Strong words indeed. He continues, we therefore have a paradox. If I win the fight, my life will be, I myself will be the absence of God, devoid of God. This is why we said earlier that sin is separation from God, a violent cutting out of God from the heart. And there is no middle ground. You will either live or die. The choice is between God and darkness, between light and the absence of light, which we call night and death. In one of his more remarkable statements, the elder goes so far as to identify human pain and suffering as the suffering of God himself. And what, he asks, is this pain that I feel? It is my participation in the pain of God. It is my experience of God's thirst for me, for God thirsts to be thirsted for. It is the pain of God's running, his loss of breath as he hastens to rescue me before I collapse and fall into the pit. Now, the image here is of God as a runner, right, running after me. Like the psalm says, your mercy, O Lord, will pursue me all the days of my life, Psalm 23. English translations render this as, your mercy will follow me. But the Greek is much stronger, katadiokin, which means to pursue, to hunt down, and even to persecute. And the phrase, God thirsts to be thirsted for, vipsa to vipsaste, is taken directly from an oration by St. Gregory the theologian. Of course, this reminds us of the Lord's words on the cross, I thirst, vipso, which reveal to us the nature and the extent of what the elder calls God's running, his seeking to find us, to save us, namely that he sacrifices or is willing to sacrifice his own life for our salvation. That's the way God runs after us, doing all that he can to save us before we reach the abyss. This is not unlike what St. John Chrysostom says when he describes Christ as a bridegroom pursuing his bride even into the depths of hell, as if he were a kind of Orpheus seeking Eurydice in the underworld, but of course this time with a much happier result. Let's return then to some of the words of the elder. Right. Illness, he says, is a time of judgment in the rich sense here of kairos, which is the Greek word not merely for chronological time, but for a propitious qualitative moment that requires a vital, life-transforming decision or action. And the word judgment from the Greek word krisis, which is where we get our word crisis from, denotes a kind of sifting or separating or differentiating that likewise requires the making of a vital decision. Illness, the elder says, is the visitation of God, a time of testing when we stand before the divine throne where God examines our hearts and reigns. Illness, he says, is a standard or a criterion by which the quality of a person's faith can be measured, as if God is sounding the depth of human nature. Illness is like a mirror in which one can see his or her spiritual state. Thus, he says, excessive anxiety about illness reveals a lack or deficiency in one's spiritual life. When someone is focused solely on his illness, which is a gift from God, it is like he is focused on creation and not the creator. Romans 1:25. It's as if all of his mind, heart, and strength were directed toward himself and not toward God. To be overly preoccupied with my health, to talk incessantly about my aches and pains, to live in fear and anxiety about my health problems, and even to pray to God to make me well, can be, the elder says, a form of idolatry, a turning away from God to what God has created. Illness is natural for us, the elder says, because it leads us to God. But our human instinct for self-preservation, our instinct to survive in this world and in this life, he says, is so worldly and so carnal and so unnatural that it will quickly lead us away from God. Why do we ask why, he says, when sickness comes, when we know the answer? God gives us illnesses so that he can bring us closer to him. So we're not really asking why to find out why, he says, but because we cannot or will not endure the affliction, and so we blame God. The why is in part a blaming and accusing of God. It is to place God on trial in the role of defendant. Illness is the trace or the presence of God. But what do? We ignore God and think only about when we can see the doctor, as if God doesn't know we are in pain. At this point, I would like to share with you a story that the elder often told about a monk in the monastery called Father Arsenios. And my name for the story is Thy Will Be Done. Father Arsenios had a problem with his eyesight and was told by the doctor that he had cataracts and would need surgery, but not right away. The doctor said they needed to wait until the condition had progressed a bit further. Father Arsenios waited, but then suddenly lost his eyesight. He went to another doctor for the surgery, but the new doctor told him, unfortunately, It's too late. You should have come to me sooner. It's too late now. I can't do anything for you. You're going to be blind for the rest of your life because you didn't have cataracts like the other doctor told you. It was something else. Father Arsenios, instead of getting angry or depressed, instead of blaming the first doctor, said, unavoidable, may it be blessed. God knows what is best for me, he said. And it was God who, quote, blinded the first doctor when he made his mistaken diagnosis. And until the day he died, the elder says, Father Arsenios never said one word against the first doctor, nor were his thoughts ever troubled about the matter. But another kind of person, the elder says, has an accident or a mishap or is diagnosed with an illness and then becomes angry at God or doubts the very existence of God. This is a very human response, but it is also a denial and a rejection of the will of God. It is a refusal or an inability to accept the reality of divine providence or of a God who is love and is the foundation of life. Rather than look at God, such a person looks only at his help or his cure. Instead of choosing God, such a person chooses his illness and thus his own spiritual and physical destruction. But the elder concludes, there are those who accept all things as gifts from God, and they use them in their growth toward perfection in Christ, and thus they are sanctified and become saints. There is no one who cannot become a saint, but we do not become saints because we want to become something else. We light, as it were, the flame of faith, but we do not want to be burned, that is, to deny ourselves. We do not want God, but choose ourselves instead. Here's more of the elder on this subject. If you mount an earth-moving struggle for your health and to extend your life, what happens then? If you live, what did you gain? Tomorrow, you're still going to die. And if you live, is this going to make you holier? But you'll say, maybe my illness will shorten the days of my life. Maybe I should ask God to give me more time, like Hezekiah, so that I have time to repent for my sins. But the church prays for God to give us time, chronos, for repentance, not years, chronia. Sometimes you need only 5 minutes to repent, or even 1 minute. It's enough to say, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, with a deep sense of repentance. Conversely, having or thinking you have many years is not necessarily good for your spiritual life, since it will lead you to postpone the work that you need to do today. I'd like to conclude, or sort of turn toward my conclusion, with another example of what it means to accept God's will in the face of tremendous challenges and adversity. It's an episode from the life of the modern Greek saint, Saint Nectarios, about whom a film called Man of God was released in late April. I've not been able to see it, but I hope to do so in the near future. Some of you perhaps have seen it. I've watched the trailer. It looks pretty good. And I notice here on the poster that the musical score was written by the great musician Zbigniew Preisner, who some of you may know as the composer for the soundtrack of filmmaker Krzysztof Kieślowski's 1988 Decalogue, a series of 10 short films, each one loosely based on the 10 commandments. It's quite stunning and gripping television for those of you who haven't seen it. And Preisner and Kieślowski were great, not only collaborators, but friends. And after Kieślowski's premature death, Preisner wrote a sort of requiem for Kieslowski called Requiem for My Friend. And one of the movements from it, called Lacrimosa, was featured by American filmmaker Terrence Malick in his well-known Tree of Life. So I just think the web of connections here between these great filmmakers and these great musicians is really intriguing. Malick, by the way, also works with, why am I forgetting his name? Well, the mind is what it is. So there are a lot of wonderful musical connections here. But let's turn to the episode from the real life Saint Nectarios. And before telling you the story, it's worth mentioning, perhaps in a bit of local pride, that Saint Nectarios was once a pilgrim to the monastery of Simonopetra. It's something that continues to be talked about as a kind of local tradition in the monastery. And if you visit the monastery and take a tour, you'll be shown a number of books in the library, books written by Saint Nectarios. He was a writer, theologian, books that he signed and gave to the monastery library, which are there to this day on proud display. Saint Nectarios died in 1920, and there are literally thousands and thousands of miracles and cures that have been documented. At the convent on the island of Aegina, they have a room with dozens and dozens of volumes containing letters and testimonies documenting the miracles attributed to the saint. The last time I was able to check the number, there were more than 20,000 documented miracles. And these are the only ones that have been documented. Presumably there are many more. And this was someone, we're talking about someone who was known to, for example, my grandparents. So the story is this: there was a nun in the convent, I mean, someone who lived not too many years ago. And the nun had what we call logismi. She had negative thoughts, asking herself, why is Saint Nectarios such a great saint? And why does he do all of these miracles, right? He wasn't a great ascetic like the great saints of old. He was just a regular person. He was just a regular bishop. He lived like we did. He ate like we did. He didn't do anything special. And these were the thoughts that were playing in the back of her mind as she was sort of grumbling and resentful and questioning the sanctity of the patron saint of her convent. Well, after a few days, the saint appeared to her in a dream, and he said to her, "Yes, you're right. I didn't do any of those great ascetical feats like the ancient saints, or other things like Saint Anthony, the Desert Fathers. But God gave me this grace because I suffered terrible trials, and I never once complained about it." And we know what they did to Saint Nectarios. And this Kafkaesque they here, we know who the they were. The they were priests and bishops. The they were the members of his own household, just like Christ, who maligned Saint Nectarios and who slandered him, and who, as a synod of bishops in Egypt, because he was a bishop in Cairo, threw him out of the church, expelled him from the church for the simple reason that they were jealous of him, they resented his popularity and the fact that people loved him. And so he ended up in Athens, essentially a beggar, without a penny and without money to pay rent or buy food. And of course, he would try to earn a few drachmas in those days by serving liturgies and preaching sermons wherever he had the opportunity. One Sunday in Athens, he came out to preach a sermon, and the people saw him and began to shout him down from the pulpit because they had heard all the rumors and the gossip that his enemies had put into circulation. And he had been accused of being an immoral and corrupt individual. And so they shouted him down from the pulpit. Here, they said, is the corrupt and immoral bishop that they threw out of Alexandria, right? And he's going to preach to us. Get him out of here, right? And there was so much commotion in the church that the saint could only say a few words and then went back into the sanctuary. These accusations and slanders did not go away. And even when St. Nectarios established the convent on the island of Aegina, he was accused of immorality with the nuns. And there was even one woman from the local village who came forward and claimed that she was an eyewitness to these things. She claimed that the offspring of these immoral relations were put to death and thrown in a well in the back of the convent. Now you can imagine the uproar that this caused. The local police were called in, state investigators were called in, a church committee with high-ranking bishops was sent also to investigate. And one of the members of the committee was a young deacon named Athenagoras, who later became Patriarch of Constantinople. We'll come back to him in a moment. Saint Nectarios was actually present at the convent when all of these investigations were taking place. And from what I can gather from the movie trailer of the film I mentioned a moment ago, this scene is depicted in the film. And as all of this was going on, one of the nuns turned to Saint Nectarios and she said, "How can you just stand there? Aren't you going to say anything? Aren't you going to defend yourself? Tell them that these things are not true." And of course, the man was about 70 years old at the time and said absolutely nothing, not a word. And he died not long after this. I say he was 70 at the time, 70 years old and dying of cancer, and said nothing. He died not long after these things happened, and he died with this terrible cloud hanging over his head. But from the moment he died, the miracles began, and from that moment until this day, they have not stopped. And that deacon who was there, Athenagoras, later became Patriarch. And he was the one who officially canonized Saint Nectarios a saint. Now, you might ask, why all of this? Right? What's the point in all of these things happening? And the point is this: so that the life of Christ may be made manifest in us and through us in this world and in this life. In our life, we will have difficulties, but we have to know how to face them. We have to know how to respond to them, which means, what is the best way for me to respond to this difficulty spiritually? And the answers, of course, are always with prayer, with acceptance, with patience, and with gratitude. I can now turn to my hopefully brief conclusion. Illness is one of the ways that God works on us. Similar to the way that one kneads a lump of dough or carves a piece of wood or stone into an image of Christ, God takes hold of us through illness and works on our soul, refashioning it and reforming it. We often think that God is going to come into our life by means of some pleasant experience that will require little or no change on our part. However, God is just as likely to enter our lives, perhaps more likely to enter our lives, through a crisis, through a serious illness or some other affliction. Because these are the signs, not of God's absence, but of his active presence. As we saw in the elders' commentary on the Psalms, God comes to us in the dark cloud, in the eye of the storm, in the midst of our difficulties. in the midst of our pain and our suffering. God is at once, paradoxically, the source of affliction and also the gentle healer, because affliction alone, it seems, can tear us away from our isolated individual existence and transform us into something much more whole and much more open. The self-consoling dreams and delusions of the ego make it hard for us to perceive the reality of God. But when all the illusions are swept away by some affliction, then I begin to call and cry out to God, like the psalmist who said, "In my affliction, I cried out to the Lord, and he heard me." My illness and the prospect of my death force me to see myself as non-existent, to know that one day I will be dead. And with the image of myself completely wiped out, I am able to see what is left without me. And what is left is everything else, everything that is not myself, which I had never seen before so clearly, but which now opens itself up to me and fills me to overflowing, so that through death I find life. And I discover that with the death of the self, all things become the object of God's perfect love. And this crisis that engulfs me, the pain that I feel, if I choose to recognize it this way, becomes a kind of birth pang. For it is the initial movement of my soul longing to be united with God. And my longing for God is met by God's longing for me. For it is God who is seeking me in and through my sufferings, in and through my pain, so that in the end, a spiritual crisis is not simply the agony of man struggling to find God, but the agony of God struggling to find man. In such moments, we're given to realize something we would have never found out otherwise, namely that our weakness, our inability, our incapacity is the presence of God sustaining us perfectly in the midst of our human poverty. Whatever it means that God loves us, that God takes care of us, clearly does not mean that God disallows painful things from happening to us. But what is possible, and this is one of the reasons the cross is so central to the Christian tradition, is the great revelation of the path of self-transformation, that in and through the very pain, the very suffering, in and through the undoing of the self, what Iris Murdoch called the unselving, right? What can take place there is the manifestation of great grace. So here then, there is an understanding of a stillness born of humility, which is most paradoxical to the ego. The stillness of being brought to naught, to the edge of oneself, to apparent nothingness, and in and through that nothingness into a fullness beyond what one can comprehend. We must not forget that the God towards which human nature advances is Christ crucified, which means that we too must also partake of his cross. Thus, difficulties, illnesses, and even death are not absent from our journey to God. If, however, we welcome the difficulties of life as our participation in the cross of Christ, then our nature is brought through these difficulties to resurrection. I began with a reference to St. Peter of the Athonite, whose memory we celebrate today, and I'll close with the words of a modern Athonite saint, St. Paisius of Mount Athos, who died of cancer, and who used to say that for all the difficulties that we have faced in our lives, one day we will thank God for all of them. For in reality, they were blessings that brought us closer to God, if that is, we are able to see them with spiritual eyes. If we had spiritual eyes, we would ask that our whole life be a trial because of all the benefits and all the grace that would come to us. So much grace that would be so much more than any prayers we could say, or any amount of church services we could attend, or all the good or virtuous deeds that we might hope to accomplish. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Father Maximos. Thank you, first of all, for your kind words about my own humble publications. But thank you especially for this thought-provoking and fascinating and frightening talk. Tough words. We have time for a few questions. Can I start myself?
Please.
We are told that Athonite elders often have the gift of foresight. And one wonders to what extent the elder knew what was ahead of himself in his own life. And did this help him to say such helpful and difficult things about illness before it overcame him? And then how frustrating that must have been for him for nearly 20 years, not to be able to function as abbot or spiritual father, and perhaps still to be conscious of his failure in that respect, except of course it wasn't a failure. I wonder if that, do you think he had any foreknowledge of what was going to happen to him?
It's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it because it's something that I'll continue to think about. But I think I've perhaps just naturally or unthinkingly assumed exactly that, because there are stories from the elder's life in which he did appear to know certain things in advance. And of course, it's sort of a commonplace, which doesn't mean it's not true, but it's a commonplace in the lives of saints that they are given a premonition of sometimes the very day and hour of their death. It's actually a very common topos in hagiographical literature. So it's not at all unlikely. It's certainly within the tradition, and we know enough about the elder to venture to say, I don't want to reveal too many things here, but to venture to say that this is more than likely. And I think so much of his teaching and his ministry in the monastery was to prepare the monks for his departure. Because one of the things that happens in a monastery when an abbot retires or dies or becomes sick or something like this, it almost always precipitates a kind of crisis of succession in the monastery. You have a community that's gathered around a charismatic spiritual leader. The loss of that leader is naturally going to precipitate, again, a crisis in the community. And the fact that his monastery held together, not simply held together, but in a sense thrived in his absence, based on the foundations that he had built, and the fact that he did not encourage dependence on his own person, but tried to build the monks to be people who could stand on their own feet in Christ, in their own spiritual life. It just seems clear that there was some awareness there and some working toward that experience. So, but again, I thank you for the question because I hadn't really posed it quite like that, and I'll continue to think about it.
Thank you. Other questions? Would anyone like to ask?
I could ask a question.
Please.
Father Maximus,
Please
thank you very much for your...
turn on your screen.
Oh, sorry.
It's like Zacchaeus. He wants to see without being seen, right?
Yes. All right. I can't be seen.
No, can you not turn on the video? Never mind, we can hear
Yeah,
you.
there we are.
There we are.
Yeah. Father Maximus, my question really is about the suffering that's brought about by drug addiction, and particularly amongst young people. This is, of course, a FoMA sickness. It's an addiction. It leads, obviously, to a life of crime and time in prison. And I'm wondering, not quite in the context of your talk, but what kind of spiritual advice could one give to someone who, in effect, is destroying their own lives?
Yeah, I mean, that's given the rates of all kinds of addictions these days, not just drug addictions. There's many kinds of addictions given, and these are skyrocketing these days, you know. This is a very serious question. And I mean, to give a talk like the one that I just gave is always something that one ventures on with a sense of, what's the word? I mean, reluctance, reservation. We certainly don't want to romanticize suffering or aestheticize it in any way. Susan Sontag wrote a book on the pain of others, and it was about the use of even journalistic photographs of people in war situations and so forth that end up being pieces of entertainment, or they become aestheticized, they win prizes. And one needs to be very, very careful here, because we're talking about human suffering, which is, you know, the greatest tragedy, you know, in that our nature has been subjected to. So when it comes to something specific like drug addiction, I'm obviously not a medical professional or somebody who deals or has expertise in this area, but I do believe this. I do believe that I don't believe that drug addiction is a choice that people make, which should result in their somehow being culpable and criminalized and imprisoned. But neither am I on the bandwagon saying that this is a disease. I think, which is a more humane approach, because it doesn't kind of criminalize the behavior. But I think that somehow misses many other things that are going on there. So I think that addictions are always that we fall into them because of some prior pain or trauma. I mean, I've read statistics that an overwhelming majority of substance abusers, something like well into the 95 or 98%, are people that have been abused. And the trauma doesn't have to be anything quite so dramatic, right? The human heart is the most sensitive thing in the world. And outwardly, a person could appear to be fine, but the fact that they were treated cruelly or indifferently by a parent, or were not held or touched or loved, can, you know, induce just extreme trauma in a child. A child will die if you don't hold it. You could feed it, you could, right? But if you don't hold the child, it will die, right? And I think so. So the addictions are attempts to ease a deeper pain, right? So they say that addiction begins in pain and it ends in pain. Right? The pain is what drives me to drink or to gamble or to drug, anything to mitigate the burden and the pain of being me, right? Of being that person that was rejected or abandoned or shamed or beaten or whatever it might have been, right? So I praise those medical professionals and others who work on the level of addiction and so forth. But there's also that deeper level. There's a pain like a river that has multiple currents. There's a sort of pain beneath the pain. There's a trauma beneath the trauma, a wound beneath the wound. And the church talks about, the wound of Adam, right? So it's just a multi-generational thing. It wasn't simply my mother or my father's fault that I was traumatized. They were traumatized too, right? So there's something deep in the human condition that has been wounded. We talk about the fall. We talk about this kind of fundamental human brokenness, that all of our nature, human nature, is broken, damaged, wounded, traumatized. Choose the metaphor that you prefer, but it gets back to the same issue. And while we need, science and medicine to care for us, on that other level, most of that tends to be about treating symptoms, right? It can't, I don't think that it ultimately gets to that deeper disconnection that took place when I was broken inside because of the trauma, and which subsequently led me to addictive behaviors, self-destructive behaviors. So that's the way I have come to see these things and understand them. And I don't know if that's a satisfactory response, but it's what I got.
Thank you very much. That was wise, I think. Thank you.
Nick, sorry, who has a question? Nick Hoff?
Hello, could I ask a question if it's possible?
Please.
Please do.
Well, because I'm retired now, but I was a medical herbalist and osteopath, mainly structural, and then doing a lot of biodynamic cranial. And I became very aware there's a very fine line between pandering to illness and, chasing after symptoms and things, but going into a deeper level. And so as one priest from the Ukraine mentioned to me, the Orthodox Church is very much in the quantum physics level, not in the mind-body split level, which actually much of the medical profession kind of progressed towards with science, in the 17th century and the age of reason. I'm not saying it's bad, it's not bad at all, it's got wonderful things, but I think they both have wonderful things, they both have a very dark side. And, I have seen people who've been tremendously helped by alternative medicine, their paralysis, so they can walk again, and then they can give that gift back to God by then becoming an osteopath and helping people. But it's part of our spiritual growth, I think, probably, to along the way that we have to learn also to lay aside ourselves, and the ego, and be thankful for the ego, but it has to be a tool. And so I'm very conscious. I'm so grateful for your talk, because I've been struggling with this dynamic for a long time. And I can begin to see now when I've fallen very, very short. So to find the way back, and actually for people who've had a very deprived beginning, or, childhood or to adult life, and there are many, many people like that now, how do they find their way to God? Because surely it's such a grace, because I do think that it can, the dissociation or whatever else, or pain or whatever, PTSD, whatever, can give them this sense of being so cut off from God that they might actually turn to drugs or relationships one after the other, or one thing or another. Their desperation to find some form of love, but they get very misguided because they don't have a good guidance, when they're growing up. So is it pride of these people because they can't respond to what's happening to them in a different way to what obviously these saints have been doing, these wonderful, wonderful people? So I think I've said more than enough, really. Thank you.
No, I think we all need to do what we can to try to help ourselves, but
Yeah.
we've all put here to help each other.
Yes.
Sometimes we need to be rescued.
Yes.
And which is why I said that criminalizing these behaviors, I don't think is the way to go. We're all carrying burdens. What would we be without our burdens? But it's not our fault that we have this or that cross. It's just part of some larger experience that might not even be fully clear to us, but we do know we have an obligation to move in the direction of the good and of solidarity with each other and with love. You reminded me, you're probably familiar with it, A couple of years ago, I read a fascinating book by Ian McChrist, I think his name is, called The Master and His Emissary. About
McGilchrist, yes.
McGilchrist, is that his name? Yeah. So you know it.
Yes, I do, yes.
I found it to be, I mean, just not just fascinating, but deeply informing and helpful. So it touches on the issues that you raise.
I haven't read all of it, but I will go back to it now you mention it.
Yeah, you're more honest than I am. I haven't read all of it either, but as much of it as I could.
I have moments of honesty, so there we are. But that was also tremendously helpful. Thank you so much. Yes.
I think perhaps we have time for one more question, if anyone would like to ask something. If not, why don't we break now?
Hello.
Oh, yes.
Hello,
John,
I just have one.
can you turn your
one
screen
thought.
on? Can we see?
One thought. Hello, everyone. No, I can't start the video. If you can hear me, that's fine. I just wanted to put the talk really into the context of this global pandemic. And I think there was an interesting perspective there of spiritual acceptance of illness and death, which can be very helpful in the situation that we're all in. But I suppose the sort of slightly question I want to ask is, we also, I think, have a responsibility to accept the benefits of modern medicine. I suppose the question, I mean, just to get to one question, would Father Aimilianos take the jab?
I don't know if I can answer that question, but he certainly was not somebody who refused. Oh, I mean, he's certainly not somebody who refused the assistance of medicine or doctors. I mean, that we know for sure. There's a helpful text in the writings of Saint Basil, who was asked pretty much the same question: should we or should we not avail ourselves of what the questioner described as the medical arts, the techne of medicine? And St. Basil said, yes, he said, because we avail ourselves of all kinds of arts, right? We don't go out into the forest and tear raw vegetables or things or fruits from the trees and eat them. We have the whole techne of agriculture, which we make use of, and he gives other examples. And medicine is simply one of the many skills or arts that human beings have developed to make their life a little easier. However, he says, it is wrong to put all of our faith into medicine or into this or that techne, no matter what, whatever. And he himself, of course, is the founder of the modern hospital and had medical knowledge and, of course, treated people medically, but also ministered to them spiritually. So science, let's say, and medicine and treatments and so forth were always unfolded in a larger spiritual, religious, and let's say ecclesial context. And when I think our technologies become divorced from ethics, and when the distance between science and wisdom, let's say, or science and ethics, when that distance becomes larger and ever larger, then, I mean, we run into problems because we create technologies that outdistance our ethical ability to deal with. I mean, I grew up during the Cold War when we had these, we still have them, we created these weapons that were so powerful and so destructive that we didn't know what to do with them, right? So that's a case of technology outdistancing. So yes, on the one hand, but with this very important qualification. So.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. Technology and ethics. I'll take that message away. I think that's good. Thank you.
I think this is a good point at which to have a break. So once again, thank you very much, Father, for your talk and also for your answers to our questions and for being with us today. We shall now break for approximately 1 hour, and reconvene at 1:45 British Standard Time for the AGM. So we'll try and start that on time. If you could be back a few minutes before 1:45. But if you're not coming to the AGM, but you want to come to the second talk, the chances are that that will begin around 2:30. But it's difficult to be precise because it will begin when the AGM ends. So let us break now. I think that the meeting technically continues, so you don't have to leave the meeting, and we shall see each other again, I hope, in about an hour's time from now. Thank you. As friends of each other, we have surely found more time to look out for others. For example, with the occasional phone call to someone who might be lonely, or a personal letter to someone in mourning. A global emergency, such as we've been experiencing for the last 18 months, can have beneficial consequences in unexpected ways, which we hope will not be forgotten as the pandemic recedes. It's been an honor and a privilege for me to steer the activities of the Friends for the past 32 years. But of course, this requires teamwork. None of it could have been achieved without the dedicated cooperation of my colleagues, all of whom I wish to pay tribute to. In particular, I'm speaking of the other members of the executive committee who put in long hours for no financial reward to ensure that the society runs smoothly, charitably, and purposefully. Our administrator is also an invaluable member of the team, as is her husband, who has provided technical support and advice when we most needed it. Our patrons should not be forgotten either, since they operate as our ambassadors across the world. And above all, our royal patron, whose active support has done so much to maintain our profile in a world where small charities such as ours can so easily be ignored in the rush to make headlines that compete for attention in a celebrity-dominated culture. I am now standing back from my hands-on role, but I shall still be around. I'm always available for consultation, and I shall continue to be actively engaged in what the Society is doing. The mountain will throw up new challenges in future years. Let us hope they're not quite as devastating as COVID-19 has been. But whatever they are, I'm confident that the Friends will respond to them as best they can. And I should like to wish my successor and his associates fair winds and following seas. One of the ways in which I fight mental atrophy in my dotage is by compiling and editing a large-scale reference book for the publishers Routledge, which will be called a Research Handbook of Mount Athos. This book will contain some 34 chapters, each written by a different scholar, covering every aspect of the history, the spirituality, and the culture of the Holy Mountain. And one of the many agreeable benefits of this task is that it brings me into contact with an enormous range of mostly young researchers all over the world who are working in these areas. Father Maximos, our speaker this morning, is, I'm happy to say, one of them, though of course we knew each other already. Another is our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Olivier de Louis from Paris. Dr. de Louis is a senior researcher at the National Centre for Scientific Research, CNRS, and we are delighted to hear that he'll be coming to Oxford as a visiting scholar for the next 2 academic years. But more importantly for our purposes today, he is a member of the editorial team that since the 1940s has been publishing the archives of the Athonite monasteries. Now, these archives are of immense importance to historians and are among the most valuable sources that we have, not just for the history of the mountain, but for that of the empire as a whole. But they're not very well known outside scholarly circles. So we are delighted to welcome Dr. DeLuy as our speaker today, and his talk is entitled Hidden Treasures of Mount Athos, the Monasteries and Their Archives. So Olivier, please continue.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Graham, for the introduction and for giving me this opportunity to address the friends of Mount Athos on today's feast of St. Peter, the Athonite. In the following 40 minutes, I would like to share some insights about the archives of Mount Athos with you. We'll also give an overview about the research on this extraordinary corpus of documents. And now I will be happy to share my screen with you. The Byzantine documents preserved in the archives of the monasteries of Mount Athos are by far the most extensive and most valuable body of documentation preserved from the Byzantine Empire. They represent about 1/2 of the entire collection of archival material surviving from that empire, surpassing all other archives, notably those of the monastery of Patmos and Prodromos near Ceres. Unlike the other archives that concerned short periods of times and local areas, the Athonite archives span more than 5 centuries, from the 10th to the 15th centuries, and cover large areas of Macedonia and Thrace, as well as certain North Aegean islands. Moreover, these documents happen in some centuries to be our only source on rural society and settlements, towns and villages, on demography, agrarian economy, provincial administration, and many other issues. These archives are published since 1945 in the famous series called Archives de l'Athos. The editing team is based in Paris in the Collège de France, which is a world-renowned institution founded in 1530 to foster cutting-edge research and teaching. Since the beginning, the French National Center for Scientific Research has also given a large material and human support to this ambitious project. This series was initiated by Professor Gabriel Millet before World War II and relaunched by Professor Paul Lemerle in 1945. Until now, the Byzantine documents of 14 monasteries have been published in 23 volumes. Each volume provides an introduction, a critical edition of the Greek text of the documents, as well as a detailed French summary and historical notes. The series has always been at the forefront of research in Byzantine history, and the team has comprised some of the great Byzantinists of the 20th century, such as Paul Lemerle, Nicolas Voronos, Nicolas Economidis, Denis Papachrysanthou, Gilbert Dagron, or Jacques Lefort. I will start with a short historical overview so as to put the genesis of the Athos archives into their context. In the early centuries, the history of Mount Athos does not differ significantly from the rest of the region of Macedonia. after St. Paul visited the region in the 1st century, repeated incursions by the Goths in the second half of the 3rd century weakened the network of ancient cities in Chalkidiki. Greek archaeologists have made a number of observations attesting to the development of the Christian faith in the following period, from the end of the 4th century until the arrival of the Slavs in the second half of the 6th century. More than 70 basilica-type churches have been identified in Chalkidiki in the late antique period, especially as we see on the map on the 2 peninsulas of Cassandra and Sithonia. There is no reason why the situation should be any different in Athos, a territory that is less fertile and therefore probably less populated, but where archaeologists have not been able to carry out as much research work as elsewhere for obvious reasons. For instance, however, a Paleo-Christian basilica has been partially excavated under the medieval church of the monastery of Vatopedi. These remains suggest that a Christian cult had existed in the same place, was discontinued at some point, and then started again in the Byzantine Middle Ages. This corresponds to a common pattern of reoccupation of religious sites that is well attested elsewhere in the region, like here in Synaxis in Thrace, but also in Patmos, etc. When the first monks arrived, Mount Athos was probably depopulated. First, it should be noted that the idea of a monastic mountain was not uncommon in Byzantium. Mount Oxentios on the Asian side of Constantinople, Mount Kimenas and Turkey's Olympus, Uludag in Bithynia, the Latros Mountains near Mile and Galesion near Ephesus, the Ganos and Papikyon Mountains in Thrace or Varasova in Epirus, already provided or would later provide similar examples of group of Byzantine monasteries, sometimes federated, set up at high altitudes and at a significant distance from secular life. In the middle of the 9th century, the monastic history of Athos emerges from the mists of time. In 843, a delegation of Athonite monks is invited to Constantinople by Empress Theodora, the widow of the Emperor Theophilus, to attend the official restoration of images after iconoclasm. A bit later, some names attest to the existence of monastic communities, apparently still not well organized. Around 859, Saint Euthemius the Younger, around 896, Saint Blasius of Amorios, and of course, Peter the Athonite earlier, visited or settled on the Holy Mountain, not forgetting the saints that we're celebrating today. The reputation of the place was already established, and the monks lived there as hermits or in semi-anachoretic communities. The first privileges given by the Emperors Basil II in 883, Leo VI in around 887 and 908, and Roman First Lecapinus in 934 quickly followed this development. In 942 or 43, the border of the monastic peninsula was fixed. In 972, 56 abbots signed the famous rule or typicon, which Emperor John Tzimiskes imposed on all monks, a text that forbade beardless men, women, and eunuchs to access the mountain. This sudden growth coincided with the installation, as we know, of Athanasius the Athonite around 957, an orphan from Trebizond who became a professor in Constantinople and who maintained excellent relations with the aristocratic society of the capital Constantinople, in particular with the Phocas family. although Athanasius did not introduce monasticism to Athos, he did propose some radical changes. First, the primacy of the cenobitic over anachoretic life. Second, imperial patronage, which provided resources and independence, particularly independence from the canonical power of the local bishop. And third, participation in the rural economy by cultivating estates outside Athos. In 963, Athanasius founded the monastery of the Great Lavra, Megisti Lavra, in the south of the peninsula, where he gathered a community of monks of various origins, including Italians, Armenians, and Georgians. Athanasius was a good scholar, as one can see reading his signature here and comparing it with the other signature of the abbots of the mountain at the time. A good scholar, he was also a a monastic legislator. He endowed his monastery with three fundamental texts: a disciplinary and liturgical rule, hypotyposis, a foundation charter, typikon, and a testament, diatyposis. However, he came up against the reluctance of the Athonite monks who preferred the ancient ways of life. Despite many setbacks, the Igumenos of Lavra, thanks to his talent for organization and above all to the unfailing support of the emperors, Nicephorus Phocas, John Zimisces, and Basil II, succeeded in giving Athonite monasticism an appearance that is still virtually unchanged today after more than 1,000 years. Following Athanasius, several great monasteries were founded in the 10th century, such as Iviron and Batopedi, and others in the 11th century, which soon found themselves at the head of considerable landed fortunes. A sign of Lavra's influence is the architecture of the triconch churches that spread, as we can see here, across the peninsula. In any case, my point is that from the reforms of Athanasius onwards, we observe in Athos a bureaucratization of the monasteries and the constitution of the first archive collections. So the exceptional preservation of Byzantine archives is the first reason for which historians of Byzantium are grateful to the monks of Mount Athos. Everywhere else, the archives of the Byzantine state have disappeared. This good fortune is due, in Athos, is due to a combination of several factors: stability of the monastic foundations, legal autonomy, and to a certain extent, geographical isolation. This does not exclude, of course, major losses due to fire, theft, or neglect. In Athos, thanks to this extensive documentation, we can follow the administrative work carried out in each of the 17 monasteries that preserved Byzantine archives. These stages of production include the purchase or the production of the blank form in parchment or paper, the copying, the recording, the authentication, the classification of documents to be kept on hand or stored in the monastery's treasury, and the annotations and comments added later on. Sometimes groups of documents glued together were assembled for resolving disputes in the Byzantine or modern period. However, the use of cartularies, that is to say the complete copy of a monastic archive, seems to be unknown in Athos before the 18th century. As I said, 1,200 Byzantine acts have been preserved in the monasteries. 3/4 of them are originals and 1/4 copies, and they are very unevenly distributed over time, since the 14th century alone accounts for nearly 60% of the document. That is at the period when the empire had dramatically started to shrink. These documents often mention others, which have themselves been lost. Would they have been preserved, our documentation would have increased by more than a third, but the extent of the losses remain difficult to estimate. As for its content, this immense Byzantine collection concerns first and foremost the wealth of the monasteries, their movable and immovable properties. So it would be futile to look for a spiritual history of Mount Athos in those archives, as they concern economic and social history first and foremost. Now for a brief typology. The imperial documents, chrysobuls and orders or prostagmata are the most prestigious and have received the attention of researchers from the very beginning. They show the concern of emperors who were working for their salvation, but who also understood the importance of facilitating, using exemption measures, the prosperity of institutions whose economic activities impacted the region of Macedonia. We should also remember that without the monasteries of Athos, Byzantine diplomatics, that is the scientific discipline that focuses on the internal and external form of the Greek charters, Byzantine diplomatics would be reduced to a minimum. Take the chrysobuls mentioned above, the documents issued and signed in red by the Byzantine emperors with a golden bull attached, hence their name. Almost all the originals have come down to us, are preserved in our monasteries. If we remove the Holy Mountain, there would be only a few units left, perhaps 30 or so documents, rarely originals, to tell the story of 1,000 years of Byzantine chancery. Orders or prostagmata have a simpler aspect. The emperor just indicates the month and the indiction in red. Let us continue the typology. Acts signed by the patriarchs of Constantinople are quite rare. Most of the time, these are documents of confirmation, judgments, arbitrations obtained during conflicts between two monasteries. State officials' documents open up the possibility for historians of writing an administrative history of Byzantium. Again, without these Athonite acts, it would be difficult to imagine the functioning of a complex and efficient administration, and, in the first place, the Byzantine tax system. Among these documents, diversity reigns. You could find acts of possession, confirmations, delimitations, exchanges, more rarely acts of sale, census, inventories, or taxations. The most complex documents are the practica. They have long been the subject of patient research by Byzantinists. In these documents, which were usually drawn up following a census and which reproduce data contained in the tax registers, the Byzantine administration describes the composition of a rural estate, that is, topographical boundaries, number of households, family structure, properties owned, in order to establish the tax base and the tax rent of an estate granted by the emperor to a monastery. Up to now, 65 Athonite practica have been published. When they are compared in time, as it is the case with 4 practica of the Iviran monastery that date to 1301, 1318, 1320, 1341, one can make very interesting observation on the demography, or the evolution of the standard of living of the listed families in these documents. The deeds drawn up by private individuals, around 30% of all Athonite documentation, also attest to the concern for the afterlife. For a Byzantine to be commemorated by the monks after having made a donation to them is to obtain a kind of guarantee for their salvation. This collection, therefore, includes deeds of gift and deeds of sale of leads, agreements, and wills. What is interesting in those kind of documents is that there is a significant proportion, nearly a quarter, which date from a period before the acquisition by the monastery. So some family archives are then preserved thanks to the transfer of property of a land to a monastery. This is, again, a unique opportunity to inquire into the history of family estates. Another extensive category, more than 130 acts already published, concern the protos, the first in Greek. The protos is attested as early as 908. He is the highest representative of Athos, elected by the monks, confirmed by the emperor, and later, from 1312, by the Patriarch of Constantinople. He has crucial administrative, disciplinary, and judicial functions, and he is assisted in this by several officers. He speaks to the external authorities on behalf of all the monasteries and has a certain spiritual authority as well. I guess that everybody knows that. Thanks to the preserved acts of the proti, it is possible to understand over time the practice of self-management of the Holy Mountain, which the monks still claim today. Sometimes we are lucky enough to discover a famous signature in those archives, such as here in Vatopedi, the signature of the famous philosopher, Neoplatonist and Byzantine humanist, George Gemistos Plethon. Therefore, as you understood, the archives of Mount Athos are of tremendous importance for Byzantine history. Together with precious objects, manuscripts, and buildings, not to mention a protected nature, they are among the true treasures of Mount Athos. Without them, Byzantine history would of course be possible, but it would be much poorer and with many questions left unanswered. So belonging to the cultural heritage of the whole of Europe, these documents have aroused the curiosity and interest of scholars of all nationalities since the 18th century, and even more so in the 19th century. Russian travelers and scholars were the first foreigners to have access to the archives of the monastery of Mount Athos. Vasilis Grigorovich Barsky is one of the first external visitors who refers to the Byzantine archives kept in the monasteries. Born in Kiev, Barsky spent his entire adult life traveling through Europe and the Middle East. His two journeys to Athos in 1725-26 and 1744-45 have remained famous, not least because of his accurate drawings. In 1744, he went to Iviron and was shown a dozen documents, 6 of which were Byzantine chrysobuls. And then at Esphigmenou, he was shown another 10 of these chrysobuls. So he recorded this fact in his travel account, which was not published until after his death in 1788, while the complete manuscript of his journey was not published until 1885 in St. Petersburg. So Barsky is the first to mention the archives presented in the monasteries, and he gives a brief description of them, but he still belongs to the group of, I would say, enlightened travelers rather than modern scholars. In the mid-19th century, things are moving faster. Porfirius Pensky, professor of theology Archimandrite and later bishop, who also traveled to Athos in 1845, 1846, and 1857, copied about 30 documents in Iviron. And in 1847, he published the first catalogue of Athonite Acts in the Journal of the Russian Ministry of Public Education. This most useful catalogue, the first one, was taken up and expanded by several scholars and was still in use until 1931. However, the revolution will come from a technical process, photography, which offers a more objective reproduction of a document than a copy by hand, and which has another patrimonial advantage. To photograph is also to preserve. And the first significant initiative came again from Russia. In 1856-57, the state councillor Pyotr Ivanovich Sevastianov began to work on the medieval testimonies preserved in Athos at his own expenses. He presented a paper on his project to the Académie des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres in Paris, and on his return from Athos, organized an exhibition also in Paris of the object he had brought back, as well as his drawings and the photographs. He received the support of the Tsar and the Patriarch of Moscow and led a new 14-month-long expedition to Athos from 1859 to 1860. The photographs in the archive documents on glazed plates were taken in 8 monasteries of Athos. These photographs are a milestone in the documentary exploration of Athos. But paradoxically, they were not used immediately. It was not until 20 to 40 years later that they were examined in a scientific way. And so in retrospect, it is clear that their purpose was primarily patrimonial, not scientific or editorial. In fact, it is in 1873 that appears the first complete edition of the Greek archive of an Athonite monastery, Saint Panteleimon, that was published in Kiev, thanks to the monk Azari, that is Alexander Ivanovich Popstov, and to a lesser extent, to the professor Philip Alexeyevich Tarnovsky. In 1880, the photographic material assembled by Sevastianov 20 years earlier finally enabled Timotei Dmitrievich Florinsky to publish a collection of selected other acts in St. Petersburg. Up to then, I have to say that the need for exhaustivity was not yet on the agenda. For instance, in 1885, Manuel Gedeon, the great cartophylax of the Great Church and the official historiographer of the Patriarchate of Constantinople, published a general history of the Holy Mountain, Athos, Anamnesis Engrapha Semiosis, where some archival documents were given randomly. In 1894, Philipp Meyer edited in his Haupturkunden für die Geschichte der Athos-Kloster a much more solid documentary record concerning the institutional and disciplinary organization of Athos, which counted pieces of the Protaton and disciplinary text of Athanasius the Athonite with the accuracy of German philology. 10 years later, in 1903, the famous Gerasimos Vernakis, or Agios to Ionoros, in this book to Ionoros, delivered further scattered documents based on copies or originals seen in situ as part of a famous general history of Athos, rich in legendary traditions. In the meantime, an actual progress arose from an unexpected but fruitful French-Russian collaboration established in Constantinople between Vasily Zhregel, co-founder of the Russian journal Vizantiskiy Vremenik, and Louis Petit, a Catholic priest from the religious order of the Assumption, a founder of the journal Écho d'Orient in Constantinople that later became the Revue des Études Byzantines in which I'm working. Regel entrusted 6 files to Louis Petit, who completed the publication of the archives of Xenophon, Pantocrator, Esphigmenou, and Chilanda. 2 other volumes were published by Regel and his collaborator, Zoographu and Philotheu. In only 10 years, from 1903 to 1913, a considerable part of the Atonite Byzantine documentation had been revealed to the scholarly public thanks to this first systematic series called Actes de l'Athos. But the austerity of these books, in which the sources were simply transcribed with no commentary whatsoever, seriously limited their use by historians. The events of 1917 in Russia suddenly shuffled the deck, and as a consequence, the collection was not continued. New characters came to the limelight. Among them was Kirsopp Lake, born in 1872, who graduated in theology at Oxford and taught at the University of Leiden and then at Harvard. Lake had published in 1909 the early days of monasticism on Mount Athos, in which he released the first edition of the life of Peter the Athonite. And Kirsopp Lake was the first to conceive the project of publishing an extensive collection of the archives of the monastery of Lavra. This idea was based on a modern cartulary typed by Spiridon Lavriotis. Spiridon Lavriotis was a learned monk, a doctor by training, who had taken the monastic habit in 1898. Then, when another French scholar, you have to imagine that there was a fierce competition at the time to edit those documents. When the French scholar Gabriel Millet in the Sorbonne learned of Lake's plans, he managed to convince the 2 men, Lakes and Spiridon, to renounce their ambition, and Lake agreed with exquisite delicacy to hand over his typing, now kept at the Collège de France in Paris, to the French scholar. So if things would have been different, the Archives de l'Athos would have been published in England. So after Petit, Gabriel Millet is really the second important French figure in this scientific adventure, and the first founder of the Athos Archives collection. He was first a member of the French School of Archaeology of Athens, and he visited the monastery of Athos 5 times in 1895, 1894, 1898, 1918, 1919, 1920. During the First World War, with the help of the photographers from the French Eastern Army, he collected many photographs. He was the first to conceive the project of a diplomatic edition of the Acts, followed by historical comments, and above all, by photographic plates. Only 1 volume was published before the war, that of Lavra in 1937. But the edition presented many shortcomings, notably because the 2 authors, Germaine Rouillard and Paul Colomb, who worked under Millet's responsibility, had not had access to the complete documentation, and because their commentary was flawed both by the dryness of their explanations again, and the abundance of no less than 15 different indexes, so this book is very hard to use. However, Millet assembled a wonderful team, and I would say a dream team, with the greatest hope of success. In 1931, Millet gave the dossier of Xenophon and Pantocrator to Father Vitalien Laurent, the Coetlemus documents to Paul Lemerle, and the Protaton dossier to the Belgian scholar Stéphane Binon. But this scholar team was decimated within a few years. Binon, a genius as far as I think in Byzantine studies, died in May 1940, aged only 32. Colomb, the first author of the first volume of Lavra, was assassinated in 1943 by a member of the Gestapo in Clermont-Ferrand. and Rouillard died an early death in 1946, age only 58. So after the war, only Le Merle, to whom I would return, and Laurent, another priest from the Order of the Assumption, remained from the original team. So in the meantime, of course, other documentary missions had followed Milles. I will here briefly mention Antonio Sigalas in 1928, a mission of the Royal Academy of Serbia in 1935, and of course, the eminent German historian Franz Dolger. Dolger, who was born in 1891, quickly established himself as a specialist in Byzantine diplomatics with his Facsimiles Byzantinische Kaiserurkunden in 1931, and the first volume of his Regesten der Kaiserurkunden from 1924 and in the next decades. His method of editing the acts was illustrated in his collection Aus den Schatzkammern des Heiligen Berges in 1948, and I will not discuss here his role during the war in Athos. Looking at the chronology, what is striking to me is the long period in which the research was to be carried out. Paul Le Merle has discovered Mount Athos in the 1930s, and it was only in 1931 that he completed the edition of Coutlemous. The edition was delayed by the war and then printed in 1945. The method was quite new and was not to change much after that. The international community at the time of Byzantine scholars agreed on the principles of diplomatic edition. And here you can read the names that counted in 1951: Dolger, Grégoire, Laurent, Le Merle, Mercati, and Manousakas. Once the method had been established, it nevertheless took Le Merle some time to build up a new and permanent research team, drawing on the students he worked with at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Sorbonne from 1947 onwards. And many years passed without any new publication coming out. The next volume in the collection, The Acts of Xeropotamu, was published in 1964. In 1970, the first volumes of Le Merle's great publishing adventure was released. It's the edition of the Lavra Monastery, 174 acts. Denise Papachrysantou is also to be noticed. She's one of the first female scholars that have been working in the team, and one of the most brilliant ones. She published in 1975 the archives of the Protaton. And far beyond the monastic monographs of the other books in the series, her book on Protaton provides one of the best introduction to the monastic origin of Athos, and it was later translated in modern Greek. The origin of the 4-volume devoted to the Iveron monasteries is based on another early photographic campaign authorized by the monks in 1971, but it took until 1995 to be completed under the responsibility of Jacques Lefort. In May 1989, Jacques Lefort became the director of the collection. And from then on, no volume deviated from the model he had perfected with Iveron. In July 1989, the master of the collection, Paul Le Merle, passed away, leaving behind a group of specialists capable of pursuing the ambition forged in the 30s. Under Lefort's direction, the edition of the document evolved, mainly in 3 areas. He expanded the analysis of the acts by integrating the summary of the rhetorical preambles. He developed the use of summary tables and cartography, and he integrated multiple skills into the editing work. So the introduction to Iveron and later to Vatopedi books include a presentation of the architecture of this monastery, placing his research in the framework of a team effort. One last monumental undertaking was supervised by Lefort until its completion, This was the edition of the impressive dossier of Greek acts from Vatopedi, comprising 247 documents, and the publication was spread out over 20 years, from 2001 to 2019. And sadly, he couldn't see the last volume printed. Finally, the project of publishing the Greek acts of the Serbian monastery of Shilandar was entrusted to Baričić in 1956, but the first volume appeared in 1998, and I'm currently preparing with Mirjana Živozinović of the Academy of Science of Belgrade the second volume, which should be printed this year. So 50 years on, only a few books remain to be prepared. The third volume of Shilandar, Zoografou in progress, St. Paul, Caracalla, and Philothea. So it has to be hoped that the corpus of the Acts of Mount Athos, as Lemel called it, will soon reach the completion that its founder would have hoped for. Until then, one can only encourage historians of Byzantium to read and to question the Archive de l'Athos. Thank you for your attention. I would be happy to answer any.
Am I now audible?
Yes, you are.
Good. I'm sorry, I was briefly muted. Thank you very much, Olivier. That was a fascinating introduction to the archives, which I think most of us probably know very little about. And we all know that the monasteries on Athos have collections of medieval manuscripts, but I think not many people know about these archives. And it is, as you say, a remarkable collection, the fact that the monks took the trouble to preserve them, and presumably knew that they were valuable, knew that they had to be preserved, knew that they had to be added to throughout all these centuries. It's remarkable. I'm wondering, in terms of practicalities, I mean, I've never looked at the archives in a monastery. I don't know where they keep the archives. Is it difficult to get access to them? I'm curious to know about this.
It is very difficult. Those archives are among the most precious documents for the monks, and one can understand this very easily. Although you can get access to manuscripts quite easily, the archives are very special because they enclose all privileges given over time by the Byzantine emperors. But also, I would say, and maybe I will come back to this later, you have also the collection of Ottoman archives with similar privileges granted by the sultans. So those official documents are very important for the monasteries. And I have to say that during the last 30 years, massive improvements have been done in terms of preservation. If you see the treasury room of Shilandar, of Zoografou, of Iviron, of Pantokrator, those are the best kept documents in the monasteries. And the monks have been always very jealous to keep them, to preserve them, and even sometimes pretending that, you know, the usual story, the librarian is not here, the key is lost. And but one can easily understand that they had to suffer from some behaviors of even from scholars in the 19th centuries that brought back with them some pieces, some folios of manuscripts, and sometimes some documents. So yes, they are difficult to be seen, and our team is now working with the monastery of Zoografou, and for instance, we had to sign a contract in front of lawyers of Thessaloniki saying what we would do and how we would proceed with the documents and with the photographs. Of course, how does the team has worked? Normally, the team would go in the monasteries, make photographs, and study the documents back in Paris. Things have been, the conditions are so much better now in the monasteries than the photographs are given by the monasteries themselves. And the quality of the photographic evidence, and I have shown some of them, is really impressive today. So the conditions for historians, for editors to work with those archives are much easier than it was in the past.
Thank you. Other questions? Would anyone like to ask Olivier something about the archives? If you have a question, please turn your screen on.
May I ask a question?
Yes, please, yes. Come in.
The first thing I wanted to do is just thank the professor for that wonderful and thorough and informative presentation. I was, of course, aware of the archives. I've seen some of these publications, but did not have a sense of the scale of this monumental project and or the value of this material. So I'm just very grateful to have had this introduction. Just one, and because it's so unfamiliar to me, I really don't have an intelligent question to ask, but I'm wondering if any of these documents, these manuscripts, are available online where scholars can, like the Vatican has its manuscripts, or the National Library of France, any attempt to make these things available to a larger audience? Thank you.
Thank you, Father Constas. I have to say that I greatly admire your work, and I've been reading what you have done. And I'm very happy to meet you by Zoom today. The responsibility lies on the monasteries themselves. And there have been a European project that finished 1.5 years ago. I think it was called Kivotos, the Ark of the Holy Mountain, where some monasteries have put some photographs of their archives online. The site is now public, but it is not finished. And as often happen with European projects, you have money to work for 5 years, and then the money stops, and then you need, people to continue to implement the project. So this is done in collaboration with the University of Thessaloniki, and some of the documents are available online, but they are very difficult to reach, although they're online. And it's not all monasteries participated, and not all documents are available. So the best thing you can do to see those documents is to go through the plates of our series, or to look at the catalog of the great exhibitions. I'm thinking about the New York Metropolitan Museum. I'm thinking about the exhibition that took place in Greece a few years ago. And some of them have been shown and reproduced in color, and you can have an idea. But as I showed, you've seen the last photograph I've shown with the team looking at a chrysobul. It's very impressive also as an object, a chrysobul. It can be 2 meters long, and it is very, it is hard to imagine the prestige attached to the document, but the monks are well aware of this document. And in Simonopetra, I think that because it's later manuscript, there's no Byzantine documents preserved. But no, there is no easy way to go through the collection of monastic archives until now. It is the same with Patmos. The only monastery that can compare is the monastery of Patmos. And again, you have to go through the plates of the diplomatic edition that have been published by the Ethniko Idrimai Revnon, the EYE in Athens. In Athens, yes. This is, but you remember I told you that there's 1,200 pieces for the Byzantine period. But if you consider the Ottoman period, you have I don't want to say a figure, but you have much more documents that are still unedited and that are very interesting for the history of Mount Athos. The problem we are facing is that we have very few scholars capable of speaking both Ottoman and modern Greek, because you need to know, and Byzantine Greek, or let's say modern Greek, because you need to know both the Greek documentation. There exists some archives in Greek in the 16th, 17th century, and the Ottoman language as well. And this is very difficult to find scholars that are able to edit, to publish, to translate those documents. But the next chapter in the history of Mount Athos will be to document the incredible history of Mount Athos during Ottoman times and how they managed to keep their independence, to keep their wealth, and to keep their traditions until now. And this is a chapter, unfortunately, I didn't learn Ottoman, but this will be when we will be finished. I think in 12 years, we will have finished with the Byzantine archives of Mount Athos, maybe 10 years. And the next chapter for scholars will be the Ottoman archives of the monastery. So I would encourage any person, any scholar to say to their, especially to their Greek students, that it is worth, especially since the access to the documentation can be difficult, and if you're Greek, it's easier. I would encourage students to be interested in the Ottoman language as well, because again, that's the new path for research.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Does anyone else have a question for Olivier?
Yes. Could I?
Sebastian?
Yes. Thank you very much indeed. That was a marvelous, fascinating talk. I had two questions. You've answered one of them about the Ottoman archive, and the other is really the matter of conservation. Some of these documents are obviously very fragile. And is there any sort of professional conservation being done?
Thank you for this question. Yes, and more and more. For instance, the last time I've been to Shilandar, there was a whole team of restorers or archivists, I don't know how to call them in English, coming from the Academy of Sciences of Belgrade that were working to make the restoration of documents. So they have been, some of them have been badly damaged. But what is interesting for us is to see that, especially with the comments on the back of the documents, or when you consider the content of the copies, you can see that a lot of documents have been damaged in the Middle Ages as well, and not only in recent time. So it is very interesting to see that we have few inventories, but we have an inventory, for instance, in Shilandar for around 1,200, 1,200 in the year 1200. And we can compare between the inventory and the pieces that are still extant today. There have been losses, and sometimes major losses, which brings the question, why would monks preserve a document and not another one? It is very interesting to see that most of, when you have conflicts between monasteries, we know that because we edit, let's say Esphigmenou on one side, the archive of Esphigmenou, and the archives of Shilandar. We see that they are fighting over lands. We have the documents proving that Shilandar won in court. But this document is not preserved in Esphigmenou. Why? Would they keep only the document proving their properties, but not proving that they have lost a trial, for instance? Yeah. This is very interesting. Why would the monastery keep this document and not another one. We have no clear answer to that. What can be imagined is that preserving a choice of documents would contribute to write the archival history of the monastery, documenting all the process with which the monastery has extended its wealth, for instance. And what is also very surprising sometimes for Western scholars is that the monasteries are still using those documents that we are editing in court today. As you know, it happens with Vatopedi in the last decade. So I've been talking, I had a very interesting talk with Father Theophilos from Pantokrator, and he was very nicely putting that we are working as historians, but monks are interested in our work because what we edit is a jurisprudence of the legal activity of the Mount Athos. So the importance is not only in terms of history, but also in legal terms, because they show how Mount Athos has managed to, as I said, to administrate itself and maintain its autonomy. So that you see, there's many aspects for which this documentation is fundamental. And sometimes not the same aspect, of course, if you're a scholar, if you're a historian, if you're an editor, if you are a philologist, if you are an economist, or if you are a monk today in Athos, thinking about the future of the monasteries.
Thank you so much.
Anyone else with a question?
Yes.
Yes, Tony.
Olivier, it's obvious there was considerable Russian interest in the 17th and 18th centuries, and perhaps there was quite a significant Russian archive at one stage, but it might not have survived the revolution. Was there?
This is an excellent question. Why were the Russians first of all interested in the archives of Mount Athos? Of course, because of the Orthodox history. So they wanted to document the history, their own history, the history of Orthodoxy. But also during even during the Byzantine period, but later on, the Slavs in general, Bulgarians, Serbians, Russians, Romanians, of course, have been the sponsors of the monasteries of Mount Athos. So you have also, and you're right on it, I should have say a word about this. You have all the Slavic material in the archives of the monasteries, and they are edited by specialists as well. So you have Slavic documents that are very interesting, and some of them are medieval, of course. They have the same dates, and I'm thinking about the 14th century, the kings of Serbia in the 14th century. I mean, they are so powerful, you know, that when they just raise their hands, the Byzantine emperor writes 2 or 3 acts to satisfy the Serbian king. And then in the 16th century, the Romanians are very important as well. I mean, the Wallachian and Moldavians. So you have a very interesting archive, yes, kept there. They were not affected by the revolution. Of course, there have been some expulsions of monks in the 20th century with some theological disputes on the name of God and so on in the early 20th century. but the archive, the Slavic archive, is quite well preserved in the monastery, and it is less extant, less important than the Ottoman archive, but still very important, of course, for for Eastern Europe, definitely.
Thank you.
Yes, and I would like to, Tony, to add that, I was saying, when would a monastery keep an archive and not another one?
Mm.
You know that between 1204 and 1261, the Byzantine Empire was a Latin empire, and we have no Latin archive in the monasteries. This is simply not possible, that there have been no documents issued and given to the monasteries, especially since we have kept some of them with the Latin emperors pretending to imitate the habits of signing in red and so on. So we have some Latin emperors of Constantinople that have produced in Latin documents that are really have the same aspect. They are in Latin, but signed in red, like the Byzantine document. But those are not kept in the monasteries. Why? We don't have any answer. Were they deliberately not preserved? Or by chance, during 60 years, would there have been no document issued to the Athos mountain? It is hard to believe. So there are many question marks concerning that remain concerning these archives.
Another example, I suppose, is the archive of the Skeet of the Prophet Elijah, which has disappeared. Our member Nicholas Fennell was able to photograph that archive in the 1980s, and was the basis of his doctoral thesis. But since then, after the expulsion of the Russian Brotherhood, that archive has been lost completely. And I don't think anyone knows where it is.
Graham, would you just allow me to show a picture, to share my screen just for one picture?
Please, of course.
Can you see this document?
Mm.
As you can see,
That
it's one. Huh? The name of the emperor, Latin emperor of Constantinople, Baudouin, is given on the top left. Yeah? And you see the signature is in Greek. Mini Februario indictionos alpha, beta, gamma, delta 14th. So this was recently in a, it was in Christie's, I think, the house of the selling house on the private market. But it's hard to imagine how come we cannot find any of such documents in the archives of Mount Athos. But again, it's very interesting how the emperor, and you know that the emperor is due to sign himself. So you can see that Baudouin here is signing, but he's not very familiar with the letter phi, for instance. He's not doing that as good as would a Greek-speaking, a native emperor would say, a native speaker would do. So that was just an example.
Yeah.
Very good.
And what was the provenance of that manuscript?
A private hand.
Yeah, and who bought it?
We don't know. I don't know. It was a few months, 1 year and a half, and we don't know. We have only 2 examples. There is only one like this that is preserved in another library from Baudouin de Courtenay. Baudouin de Courtenay was the emperor, and so it's still very funny that the Courtenay is a village in the center of France, you know, and that the Baudouin de Courtenay would have some members of his family. I mean, the family of Courtenay would have some members signing in Greek a document in Latin. This is quite exotic.
Good. Any other questions for Olivier? Well, I think perhaps we should draw our proceedings to a close, but it remains for me to thank him once again for his fascinating presentation and for answering all our questions. I would normally call for a round of applause for both of our speakers for today. I think you have to imagine applause, rapturous applause.
Thank you. Thank you, Graham. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We very much look forward to having you in Oxford as soon as possible.
And could I thank you, Graham, on behalf of all of us, for your excellent chairing of today's sessions.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Graham. Thank you.
We muddle along, don't we? Somehow we seem to get there. Now, I would normally also be advertising future events. I think the only event that we are hopefully really going to have is the autumn meeting, which will be on the 11th of November, which I think Peter referred to earlier. Nothing else in the diary before then, as far as I'm aware. But possibly a pilgrimage later in the summer. We'll see. We have to wait and see how things go. So thank you all very much for joining this meeting, and we hope to meet again soon for real somewhere.